If the political truths stated or approximated by Machiavelli were widely known by men, the success of tyranny and all the other forms of oppressive political rule would have become much less likely.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mind Matters. I'm Harrison Cayley. We've got Elon Martin and Lucien Koch. Today, we will be talking about this book, Machiavelli, The Prince. So we mentioned Machiavelli briefly, well, maybe not too briefly, at the end of last week's show. And none of us had read Machiavelli before, only excerpts. So we decided to dig in. It's only 80 pages in the version I've got, so it's a quick read. And I guess to start out with, I want to ask you guys for initial impressions and just what you thought. Was it what you expected? Was it everything you hoped it would be?
I hope for some more cruelty and cynicism. And there was some in there, but the picture you kind of have in mind when thinking about Machiavelli is like this total psycho, and it's just way over the top. And yeah, there is some of that in there, but I was kind of surprised that much of it was actually like pretty normal, when looking at the political going ons, both today and historically. It's like, I mean, that's kind of like the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
He was utterly rational. I think people confused the subject matter with the approach. And his approach is to look at everything as it was. And because so much of it is so speaks to objective truth, applies to what is in many cases. And, there were several times, and in Burnham's book, an analysis of Machiavelli, just one truth kind of after the next, that Machiavelli was able to hone in on, and, left me wondering, gosh, do the writers and analysts of cyclical history, did they draw upon Machiavelli's writing, or are these all truths that they came out from their own separate research? And so, just as relevant today, I think, as when he was writing in the 1500s and early 1600s.
Well, I want to point out what both of you kind of just mentioned about Machiavelli. He was pretty much an empiricist to a large degree.
Or 14, I'm just correcting myself,
Okay.
1400s and early 1500s, yeah.
So I want to read a bit from the introduction, just one paragraph from the introduction to this volume by Anthony Grafton. He wrote, "Yet from the first, Machiavelli insisted on the originality of his approach to even the most traditional of the questions he addressed. Earlier humanist treatises on the ideal prince began with general ethical principles, the nature of man, the purpose of government, the connection of both to the pursuit of the virtuous life. Machiavelli, by contrast, boldly claimed that he would treat politics as it really is. He divided all participants into two categories, or all principalities into two categories, new and established, and explained, without making any value judgments, what a prince would need to do in each case in order to hold on to his kingdom." And then just a quote along those lines from chapter 15, "The things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed," there's one sentence from there. "But since my intention is to say something that will prove of practical use to the inquirer, I have thought it proper to represent things as they are in a real truth, rather than as they are imagined." So this is something that that stood out for me, and that I've seen in several I guess, commentaries or people writing about Machiavelli, like he's considered the progenitor of political science in the sense that he wasn't approaching it as it was common in the time, like the introduction mentioned, for starting with general principles and then showing what an ideal prince should be. Like a somewhat contemporary was like Erasmus, who wrote a similar mirror. What are they called? Mirror for the Prince. Basically an instruction manual for princes, and here are all the virtues you have to have and how good you have to be, and to be a good Christian ruler, a good Christian autocrat or prince. And Machiavelli was actually, a politician. He was a diplomat. He was an ambassador. He was involved in statecraft in like Florence and in this time period. So he actually had experience dealing with politics from the inside and knew a lot of the big players. He interacted with them. So this was more of, on the last show, I mentioned that there are various interpretations of Machiavelli, including like that he was, that this was a satire. Of course, I mentioned that he was actually a Republican by nature. He preferred a Republican system of government as opposed to an absolute monarchy. And I think, after reading this, I think it's pretty clearly not a satire. But it is kind of, I think everyone's done this before, when they're thinking, well, if I was dictator, this is what I do, this would be really evil, even if it's not in a person's nature to actually do that. This is kind of, I think that's kind of what Machiavelli was going for. If you look at the political situation, like Burnham mentions, his goal was to unify Italy. That's what he wanted. Like he wanted a unified Italy, not all of these disparate and often warring statelets run by their own princes, but a unified Italy. And this book is pretty much, if you are a prince, if you aspire to be or will become a king, here are the things that you will actually be doing and that you will actually have to do by looking at history and contemporary politics. So in that sense, he was a political scientist. He was saying, well, here's what has worked. I've read the classics. I've been in politics. I've seen what goes on around the world, in my own region, in Italy proper, and in wider Europe, and the extent of the Roman Empire. Here's what has worked, or here's what, based on my reading of things, based on my awareness of and perception and appraisal of the facts, here's what works, here's what doesn't work. So in that sense, it's kind of like a, even if an absolute monarchy isn't his preferred form of government, he's saying, well, if you are an absolute monarch, here's what works. That's the impression I pretty much get from the book is that that's pretty much all he's saying. He's not really necessarily like, just like in the introduction, he's not advocating for something. He's not saying this is the perfect system of government. This is the way it must be. Here's the justification for why this has to be. He's just saying, well, this is just the way it is.
Yeah. One question I had in mind was, is Machiavelli being cynical, or should we be refreshed by this naked view of politics as it really exists? Because it's reality hitting you full frontal. It's an attack of a accurate perception of what actually is, in a way. And we, I'm sure maybe not us, but a lot of people have this idealized version of what government is, or what it should be, what it should aspire to. And these may be ideals that are, once you read Machiavelli, completely unrealistic. And actually, if pushed too far in many cases, injure the body politic, injure the citizens, and make things worse. So, it's like, first do no harm, first see things exactly as they are so that you can treat the conditions on the ground.
In Machiavelli's case, first do harm and then do less harm.
Yeah, and I think that they you know what kind of what I found interesting reading this is that on the one hand it seems like a bit of like a moral relativism, right? I mean, just do whatever whatever is good for your cause, right? For your state, and to hell with morality. But then again, there are also some elements in there. When he talks about that he says sometimes moral behavior is a weakness, right? Like if you are too generous and give all your riches away to the people, then at some point you're going to be like broke and then have to tax the hell out of them. So that won't last. So in a sense, sometimes I got the impression that he's like arguing against like a black and white and too simplistic form of morality, where you say, to be moral, you should always do this, even though the circumstances might change and it might be like way more complex than that. And he also clearly didn't like those people who go overboard with cruelty. When he cited the examples of rulers basically like tricking, I don't know, like the nobles to take part in a meeting and then just slaughter them all. And he gives some examples like that he says like, no, that's just totally overboard. So that there is some kind of a moral dimension to the whole thing. It's just not like a simplistic form where you describe the virtues that a prince should have, and that's always how you act. So he was like brutally, pragmatic in that sense. Yeah. So your goal is to keep your thing together, and to get your status entrenched and your state secured. And that's all that counts. And here you go. But the moral dimension, I guess, comes in more subtly in the sense of like, why do you want to keep your state, and what do you want to do with it? What are the motives, right? But that dimension, he doesn't really talk about that much.
Yeah. At a few points, he basically says, I haven't collated them together to make like to bring together his basic principles of what the state is, but there were a few kind of grand themes that came out, and one was like the centrality of war, first of all, especially when you look at the historical context, and not much has changed. The forms have changed, but still, even if the world isn't constantly at hot war with each other, all nations aren't constantly at hot war with each other. Hot wars still exist, and war has progressed or progressed. I don't know if that's the right word, to different forms, like economic, political, revolutionary warfare. There, hybrid warfare. There are tons of different types of warfare now, and warfare still is a constant in in statecraft. So there's that centrality of war, and then he talks about pretty much the prince's purpose is to purpose, and the things that the only two things that are essential are essentially to be well armed and well funded. You need money and you need soldiers, and so he's pretty much strips everything down to the very basics of the absolute minimum of the minimum number of factors to consider when looking at a prince in a state, and then he gives the conditions for how things will work. Because if it all pretty much makes sense if you're going to, and this is kind of implicit and explicit at a few times when he's talking about it, but the when you look at politics, when you look at leaders, what are the conditions of, let's say, a good leader? Or let's look at some situations. If a leader is responsible in some way for the utter destruction of his own state, then you can pretty much say that's a failure. If you end up producing or ruling over a rich state that is at peace, that conquers other nations successfully, again historically, then that is considered a good ruler, and that was pretty much the case, through this entire time period. Going back to, just look at the Romans. The Romans loved war and loved expansionism, and that's one of the reasons Caesar, for instance, was so popular, is because people liked war. They liked a ruler that succeeded in battle, and by those conditions, a lot of the kind of dichotomies that he makes, the contrasts that he makes, are what are the conditions that work for these things? Like, okay, well, let's look at armies. Well, here are the reasons that mercenary armies haven't worked in the past and the present. Here are the reason why foreign armies are a danger. Here are all the precedents for why it seems that a local army made of the citizens of the state are successful, and why that works. So he gives the reasons for this. And then, of course, he talks about money. He talks about allies with alliances with neighboring states and how those work, and what conditions lead to essentially a successful state, one that isn't overrun, one that doesn't fail. So it's, like you said, it's a very pragmatic, practical approach. And that seems to be the way politics works. And there is a kind of, despite his all of the statements where he kind of eschews and kind of sets aside like conventional morality, like you said, Luke, it is implicit. Like, I want to read what I thought it's probably one of the most famous sections in this book, and it's the one that stood out to me, in the section on, because this has one of his, I guess, most controversial statements. Yeah. So this is the chapter 17, cruelty and compassion, and whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the reverse. So he talks about compassion here. I'll read a few excerpts, and then comment on them. So it starts, taking others of the qualities I enumerated above, I say that a prince must want to have a reputation for compassion rather than for cruelty. Nonetheless, he must be careful that he does not make bad use of compassion. Caesar Borgia was accounted cruel. Nevertheless, this cruelty of his reformed the Romagna. I hope I pronounced that right. Brought it unity and restored order and obedience. On reflection, it will be seen that there was no more compassion in Caesar than in the Florentine people, who, to escape being called cruel, allowed Pistoia to be devastated. A little historical reference. So a prince must not worry if he incurs reproach for his cruelty, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal. So he's placing a very specific context for how compassion should be used and should be present or not. But then he says that you can be too compassionate, and that these nearly always harm the whole community, whereas executions ordered by a prince only affect individuals. A new prince of all rulers finds it impossible to avoid a reputation for cruelty because of the abundant dangers inherent in a newly won state. Nonetheless, a prince must be slow to believe allegations and to take action, and must watch that he does not come to be afraid of his own shadow. His behavior must be tempered by humanity and prudence, so that overconfidence does not make him rash, or excessive distrust make him unbearable. So again, he's always, despite his getting rid of or ignoring conventional morality, he's always walking a tightrope about not going too far in one direction or the other. Because if you go too far in one direction, for instance, with compassion, too much compassion will get you killed, or make you vulnerable to like an invasion, or a conspiracy against you, or one of your subordinates staging a coup against you, or just taking you out and taking your position. And too much cruelty will make you hated, and will therefore make your continued rule, more difficult to carry out. So then this is the main paragraph that I want to read that was so good that I thought was so interesting. From this arises the following question, whether it is better to be loved than feared or the reverse. The answer is that one would like to be both the one and the other. But because it is difficult to combine them, it is far better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. One can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. While you treat them well, they are yours. They would shed their blood for you, risk their property, their lives, their sons, so long, as I have said above, as the danger is remote. But when you are in danger, they turn away. Any prince who has come to depend entirely on promises and has taken no other precautions ensures his own ruin. Friendship, which is bought with money and not with greatness and nobility of mind, is paid for, but it does not last and it yields nothing. Men worry less about doing an injury to one who makes himself loved than to one who makes himself feared. For love is secured by a bond of gratitude, which men, wretched creatures that they are, break when it is to their advantage to do so. But fear is strengthened by a dread of punishment, which is always effective. And there is later on this chapter is only a few pages long, but I don't think I have it highlighted. But even then, there's a qualification to what he just says there. Where is it? When he's talking about, well, I can't find it, but just as a general point, he always says, like even here, it's better to be both compassionate and to be feared. But, if you're not the type of person to have both qualities, then at least be feared. So the later qualification was that, okay, it's important, it's good to be feared, because you can't come across as a weak pushover or someone who is easily going to be, taken over and destroyed. But that doesn't mean that it's good to be perceived as cruel and like a tyrant. Mm-hmm. Like there's always a limit with Machiavelli. There's what works, and then there are the things that when you go to the extremes, like he cites a lot of the kind of post Vespasian Roman emperors like Caracalla and Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, and looking at why some of them worked and why some of them didn't. And he has no love for the biggest tyrants, in Roman history, like the most brutal ones like Caracalla and Commodus. And well, he gives reasons for all of those. But did you guys have any thoughts on that compassion and fear chapter, or anything else?
Well, it reminded me, just bringing it down to an interpersonal level, of what Jordan Peterson discusses when he talks about people, especially men, needing to show their teeth, which is to say that you're not going to be effective in any interpersonal relationship or work relationship if you're not every so often, or when appropriate, able to demonstrate that you can be not nice. And it doesn't mean excessive cruelty. It doesn't mean being a total asshole. It's just the ability and the recognition in the moment, based on the particular circumstances, as you were alluding to earlier, Luke. The timing is important. What's appropriate. But this was. This is an idea that's been put out in videos and discussions by Peterson and recognized by a lot of people. Doesn't help to be nice in all situations. As far as this kind of duality that of cruelty and love and compassion, there are a few of these dualities that Machiavelli puts forth. And Burnham comments on as well. The combination of force and fraud is picturesquely referred to in the famous passages of The Prince, which describe the successful ruler as both lion and fox. Now, this is interesting. You must understand that there are two ways of contending, by law and by force. The first is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because many times the first is insufficient, recourse must be had to the second. It belongs, therefore, to a prince to understand both, when to make use of the rational and when of the brutal way, and this is recommended to princes, though abstrusely, by ancient writers, who tell them how Achilles and several other princes were committed to the education of Chiron, the centaur, who was to keep them under his discipline, choosing them a master, half man and half beast, for no other reason but to show how necessary it is for a prince to be acquainted with both, for that one without the other will be of little duration. Seeing, therefore, it is of such importance to a prince to take upon him the nature and disposition of a beast, of all the whole flock, he ought to imitate the lion and the fox. And so, as I usually like to do when we're looking at older literature or classic literature or literature of a political nature, it helps me to put it into a contemporary context, to apply it to things I'm seeing in domestic politics, in geopolitics.
Yeah. And I wondered also how many leaders in politics actually have read that book, or for whom this book was part of their education, right? Because it's such a classic. It's probably like one of the cornerstones of political writing. Unfortunately, most people don't really read it in school, which is kind of interesting because it's so short and so easy to read. Would be like a good good project for every student. But I'm sure, like, if you get a real political education, you're gonna read that book. So I also wonder, like, how many like leaders, whether in the military or politics or wherever, like actually do apply some of these principles, or like at least have thought about them. And I mean, one of the things that Machiavelli said is if you're gonna be cruel, it's better to be like very cruel, very fast, and very short, and then immediately refocus on serving the people again, right? So so that was one of his points. So you can see that kind of in action, I think, in current events, that this idea to just go all in, very swift, very decisively, and then stop it immediately and refocus on building, basically. And so that's kind of interesting. And about your point, again, about morality and Jordan Peterson, I wanted to read another quote. I think it's also from chapter 18, because it speaks to that point as well, I think. So he writes, a prince, therefore, need not necessarily have all the good qualities I mentioned above, but he should certainly appear to have them. I would even go so far as to say that if he has these qualities and always behaves accordingly, he will find them harmful. If he only appears to have them, they will render him service. He should appear to be compassionate, faithful to his word, kind, guileless, and devout. And indeed, he should be so. But his disposition should be such that if he needs to be the opposite, he knows how. You must realize this, that a prince, and especially a new prince, cannot observe all those things which give man a reputation for virtue, because in order to maintain his state, he is often forced to act in defiance of good faith, of charity, of kindness, of religion. So I think it's a similar idea. So he's basically saying that no, these are good values, and he should even have them, but he should have the ability to act differently if the need arises. And I'm not sure if he, like, with these values, he means some very complex moral theory or something. The way I understood it is more like that. It's like the basic rules that most people would apply, to concepts like virtue, but in a very like rule kind of form. So don't do this, do that, never do this, always do that kind of thing. And again, I think that's what Jordan Peterson is always warning people against, and which kind of makes sense, because sometimes different circumstances demand different actions that can in and of themselves be moral too, on a kind of different level. So without maybe like giving Machiavelli too much the benefit of the doubt, because it can be kind of cynical what he writes. Mm-hmm. So I think that's fair to say. But it's an interesting point, this kind of moral flexibility in a sense, but then again, to see it from the point of view of a higher goal, where sometimes you cannot apply like strict black and white rules.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where do I want to go with that? When you look at politics, let's tie this into some of the other things that we say about politics. So, I mean, when we talked about the managerial revolution at the end of last year, beginning of this year, one of the points that we brought up about kind of modern politics, and particularly, but probably all politics of all time, is that it is this kind of this gray area where, like we've been saying, conventional morality doesn't really apply. It doesn't apply to the way things actually work. And when you look at, even if we just look at that one thing about to be feared or to be loved, and Machiavelli says, well, if you can't be both, it's better to be feared. So a lot of what he's writing is just very practically based. It's like, okay, so what are the chances that you'll find, let's say, like a really good man, a really good leader? Well, they're pretty few. If you take a sampling of the population, there probably aren't very many that you could find, especially randomly. Like if you were just randomly select someone and make them a leader, it's kind of like randomly selecting someone to be in a professional orchestra or something. Chances are you're not going to find a person that's suited to the role. So with politics, there's going to be a selection process, of course, that leads to the people who are potential leaders. And historically, a lot of the time that has been being born into a noble family, for instance, one who will inherit rule or inherit wealth and position. Not always, but to a large degree. And so there's a selection process that goes on, but really, what are the chances that you're going to get, a good leader out of that? Well, maybe it might be higher, it might be lower, who knows, depending on the circumstances. But when you look at the qualities that are needed, if it is better to be feared, then chances are leaders, that in itself is going to be a selection process. And who's more likely to be feared? Someone who's conventionally considered to be a good person, or someone who's conventionally considered to be more like of a Machiavellian tendency. So you're probably going to get some more people of questionable character, and you see that in a lot of these examples that he gives. Some where they, that obviously goes too far, and you get examples like Commodus and Caracalla and Sulla from the Roman period. Then, of course, you will get people that seem to excel at it and who do have that flexibility, who aren't totally or aren't too one-sided in their character. But then again, as he points out, that it's very hard to go against your character, against your nature. So you'll have someone who's perfect for the role, perfect for the circumstances, and that might be because of their mildness, for instance, like Marcus Aurelius, who, because of the conditions that he ruled under, as a hereditary leader, managed to keep everyone in check and have a relatively well functioning state. But then his son comes along, or his heir. I can't remember, but whatever. But then when conditions change, that won't necessarily carry over into the new conditions. And this is a point he makes near the end of the book, in the discussion on the role of fortune or chance, or events beyond your control, because he's trying to determine what the role is of just fate, things that are outside of our control, and what is within our control. And the point I think, generally the conclusion he comes to is that things can work under certain conditions, but in new conditions, they won't work. And it may be often that a person who is perfect in one set of conditions, when conditions change, either won't be successful or wouldn't be successful in different conditions. And all of this, I'm just kind of trying to get to the point that that it's probably easier for a person who is on the dark triad spectrum of human personality to do a lot of the things that Machiavelli is talking about. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be ideal rulers in Machiavelli's sense. I guess that would just come down to practice, if they're actually able to do it. But this is just something that I haven't totally formulated, because I'm still trying to work it out, and I don't know yet exactly what I think about it. Because there are just these questions, like what is the personality type for a lot of the qualities that Machiavelli is talking about. I think that given what he writes and given all those qualifications, that you would actually have to be a very intelligent and like, I'd say, moral person to be able to do a lot of the things, but that the kind of conventionally moral person wouldn't be able to make like a lot of the hard decisions. And this is, I think, like a common kind of hardcore conservative like perspective, where you've got to what are some of the things hardcore conservatives say about we saw a lot about it in the Bush years. It's just there's no room for bleeding hearts.
Leader.
Yeah, you got to be a tough leader. Sometimes you got to make tough decisions. Oh, well, the best example was like Dick Cheney talking about the CIA, right? Sometimes you got to work in the shadows, and I think that's how he put it. You got to work in the dark places. He wasn't the only person that said it during that decade, but it is an interesting. It's still a kind of a mystery and a question. Well, I guess so there are a few different perspectives, a few different hypotheses on why this is the case. Some would say, some would argue, and this is in some of the kind of psychological literature, that that politics in itself selects for psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians, and that's just the way it works. And so this was something that view was kind of expressed in our interview with Spence, Richard Spence, the Russian Revolution. That they're all psychopaths, right? And then there's another. I don't know if I'd go that far. I think that for me, that there's probably a higher percentage of kind of dark triad types within politics, but that a lot of it is just that humans in a given situation, they acquire the mentality, the worldview, the way of doing things of the people around them, and so that normal people can do all of these things too. They can act, they can lie, they can believe their own lies, they can lie without believing their own lies, they can engage in any kind of all of the things on the spectrum of what we consider good to evil in the political realm. And that I think that it's that fact that makes it easier and more of a danger of a person like Caracalla or Commodus, or Sulla to actually gain power and to be able to push things to an extreme. But that, but coming back to the idea of, an actual good leader, it's almost like, where did I see this? There's almost this weird progression. I've always thought of it in terms of something that they use in music. When you're talking about the sections of a song, you can say A, B, A. So you start with one section of the song, and then you have a second section of the song that's different, that kind of contrasts with the first, and then it comes back to the first one again, A. So you play the A section, the B section, and the A section again. And a lot of music works because of variation. So oftentimes when you come back to the main theme, the main section, it'll be slightly different. So you put A and then you put a little asterisk next to it, or not an asterisk, an apostrophe, A prime. So it's slightly different than the first time. So the way I kind of look at, for some reason, I just see that pattern a lot. So in this sense, it would be like the conventionally moral person would be A. And then you'd have like a kind of amoral, like totally kind of pragmatic person, which is B. And a person can kind of, and then the A would be the one that kind of encompasses both, that is essentially a decent person, but like you were saying, Alon, like Peterson says, that can incorporate aspects of that dark personality when required, because sometimes it is required, like in a situation of self-defense, like a person who's totally like a pacifist and nonviolent. Well, when they get attacked, or when let's make the stakes even higher. When their family gets attacked, they can do nothing, and be a pacifist, and perhaps let their family be massacred, or they can adopt a bit of that violence and that monster nature within them to defend against that attack. And that seems to be the point that I see Machiavelli making a lot, is that if you just go along, like you were saying, Luke, with the rules-based morality, always do this. Well, if you always do this, then you'll actually get an outcome that is unwanted, and that it is potentially a bigger evil than the one that you were trying to avoid by trying to be, good, like in this case, nonviolent. But that reality is more complex than that, and there aren't such basic, simple situations where that one mode of operation works in all situations. Like that's just not. It's not what life is like. It's not what reality is like. Reality is more complex, and in a situation. In international politics and statecraft, of course, there's going to be complexities, which involve, okay, are we going to have to go to war? Are we going to have to prepare to go to war? Well, we can be a totally pacifist nation that's totally against violence and against warfare and totally demobilize and have no weapons whatsoever. And then imagine being that in the time of Machiavelli around 1500. Well, what's going to happen? You're going to be invaded, and you're going to be taken over. And then you're no longer going to be able to be this pacifist nation. It's just not going to work. You have to be able, first of all, you have to be able to defend yourself. You have to have an army. You have to be able to project that strength to the nations around you, to the states around you, that they don't want to invade you because they might not get away with it. And that seems to be the realm for me where morality enters the picture. Yeah. What do you guys think? I was just rambling a lot in there, but maybe I had a couple good points.
You did. This is Burnham again, by the way, who's distilled so much of The Prince and so much of Machiavelli's writings, who was pretty prolific. I didn't realize that he had so many longer and shorter works under his belt. But Burnham writes, in any case, Machiavelli is not so naive as to imagine that the law cannot support itself. The law is founded upon force, but the force in turn will destroy the law unless it also is bridled. But force can be bridled only by opposing force. So, this is like, yes, we can say we are a nation of laws and even mean it, but without the power of brute force behind it to ideally implement it and enforce it and make sure that it's followed among those who would be less likely to follow it, the laws can be trampled upon. And as far as leadership goes, I was thinking a little bit, Harrison, of Jeremy Corbyn, the British politician and member of parliament, whose outspokenness on several issues made him vulnerable to being smeared and attacked and lied about by the ruling party. And you just wish that, basically, even if you don't agree with everything he says, basically a compassionate kind of protector, or what's the word? He's an endorser of law, international law, domestic law. You wish that he had the power to bite back, to be able to, in some forceful, meaningful way, respond to the smears and to the opposition that would completely squash his otherwise pretty reasonable voice on a number of issues. So that's what came to mind as far as domestic politics, and we could certainly point to one or two U.S. politicians who have similarly been silenced or lied about. Tulsi Gabbard comes to mind. I did want to get back to something we talked about last week, which bears repeating. It was said in your introduction, Harrison, and that is that politicians, by and large, the princes of politics, are after, for the most part, or in many cases, or maybe most cases, power. End stop, full stop, period. Power to exert their influence, power to accrue more power to themselves. And there is still among many folks, I think, a tendency to not recognize what that will of power is about. Like you were saying a few minutes ago, how the dark triad is, even if it isn't full blown among many politicians, it exists to some degree or another among many of them. And when we started talking about Machiavelli last week, we were kind of going back and forth about what our perception of Machiavelli was as it was promulgated and through, general education and various ideas, and what he really is about. And again, I'm going to read from Burnham, who says of Machiavelli, he says this, and I think it cuts straight to the chase. In any case, whatever may be the desires of most men, it is most certainly against the interests of the powerful that the truth should be known about political behavior. If the political truths stated or approximated by Machiavelli were widely known by men, the success of tyranny and all the other forms of oppressive political rule would have become much less likely. A deeper freedom would be possible in society than Machiavelli himself believed attainable. If men generally understood as much of the mechanism of rule and privilege as Machiavelli understood, they would no longer be deceived into accepting that rule and privilege, and they would know what steps to take to overcome them. Therefore, the powerful and their spokesmen, all the quote-unquote official thinkers, the lawyers and philosophers and preachers and demagogues and moralists and editors, must defame Machiavelli. Machiavelli says that rulers lie and break faith. This proves, they say, that he libels human nature. Machiavelli says that ambitious men struggle for power. He is apologizing for the opposition, the enemy, and trying to confuse you about us, who wish to lead you for your own good and welfare. Machiavelli says that you must keep strict watch over officials and subordinate them to the law. He is encouraging subversion and the loss of national unity. Machiavelli says that no man with power is to be trusted. You see that his aim is to smash all your faith and ideals. Small wonder that the powerful, in public, denounce Machiavelli. The powerful have long practice and much skill in sizing up their opponents. They can recognize an enemy who will never compromise, even when, quote, that enemy is so abstract as a body of ideas, end quote.
Yeah.
So, did you have any thoughts on that, Luke?
Yeah, I was just going to say that goes back a bit to my point earlier. The question why Machiavelli isn't widely read in schools. I mean, that would be like the ideal project for a school class. It's short and it's on point, and you could discuss it, right? But somehow that doesn't seem to happen. Or I don't know. Maybe you have read him in school, but apparently not. So me neither. And I think there's some like dangerous knowledge in there, in which speaks to the quote that you just gave, Inan. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, there is a way when you read that book that makes you able to see behind the facade a little bit of all the political fluff that's being thrown at us, right? I mean, if we remember like all that talk about democracy and values, and when they bombed the Kosovo in the 90s, they said it's because of our values and because we're just compassionate, right? And things like that, and many of these values, or maybe not the values, but these kinds of talks are really just that political fluff. And at least I had the experience when I read Machiavelli. It really sharpens your eye, and you almost get a glimpse into the minds of people in politics or behind politics, and how they work, and how they just rationally and brutally say, okay, we need to bomb that country, back to the Stone Age because there's this and that reason, and so we do it, and it's had nothing to do with all that fluff, and also like the power of the people, ideas like that's that we kind of associate with democracy, as if the people, as if the little guys rule the state, right? I mean, this idea is kind of, I know it's an ideal, but it's still it's a bit absurd to make those claims when you look at reality and how it really works. And so in that sense, I think the book is kind of dangerous for certain people, and it's a good reason to study it. And maybe one aspect I would add is that one thing that Machiavelli doesn't mention at all, and I think that's maybe just because of historic reasons, but this idea that a nation or a state needs some kind of ideology, to hold it together, and or some kind of idea or value system. Often it's based on religion or a mixture, and I won't solve this problem here now, but I think it's an interesting question as to how we nation states or whatever groups need these kinds of ideas as well, and whether it's all just fluff, just justification and rationalization, or whether there's something to that, this idea of an ideology of some kind that needs to be there, and what is the relationship between the leaders and such ideas, because I suspect it would be too cynical to just write it off as just nonsense, although a lot of it certainly is. So that's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, I think that I've been reading several things concurrently, so I can't remember for sure, but I think that the other Machiavellians in Burnham's book, like Mosca, Perito, and Michel's, I think they get into that area too. From what I've gotten into. I just want to correct something I said last time I was talking about this book. I accidentally conflated the names because I wasn't familiar with them of Sorel or Sorel and Michel's. I said Sorel's, but they're two different people, Sorel and Michel's. And if we discuss this book more, we might get into some other things. But yeah, maybe that can be. We'll probably get to that in the future and try to answer that question, Luke. We'll get to the bottom of it. We'll figure it out.
Wonderful.
But maybe the last thing I wanted to say as a comment on what you were just saying was that there is this kind of tension between, that I noticed in myself, between like Machiavelli as kind of tearing down the veil of what politics actually is, and kind of revealing something that isn't palatable. And then what we were discussing earlier about, well, when you actually think about it, it makes sense. So there's this kind of tension of, oh, well, these people are actually just liars, but then you can see it from their perspective now. You can see, oh, well, this is why they do it. Like you mentioned, this is how any government conceivably, in certain conditions and definitely historically, can just decide to wipe out an entire country, right? You can see in Machiavelli that there are practical reasons for why it would be done and why people can rationalize that to themselves or justify it, because it can be justified when looked at from a certain perspective. But then that's kind of in conflict from just the kind of gut reaction that you have when you say, oh, well, but they only seem to be these nice people. They're only pretending to be. They're just it's all a PR campaign, just to get us to think this way. So that is a tension that I haven't resolved in myself yet, but I think it's an interesting one to observe. That my first inclination is to think that that there's probably like a scale of deception. There are because just like in humanity, if we take it down to the individual level, and if you just look at individual humans, at the one extreme, you have the pure psychopath who is almost like a completely empty shell who just projects whatever image you want of him or her to get what they want. And then you have a person who isn't a psychopath, and I guess the most maybe the most polite way of saying it is that they have tact, right? Because there are certain situations that you get in where you are going to present things a certain way, right? Where you either don't want to ruffle feathers, so you don't want to say something that might it could be just you just don't want to say something that you actually believe that might offend another person, and that's a form of lying, on the basic level. Or there could be an element of deception involved too, where the typical example is in wartime, right? Well, everyone agrees that in wartime, you have to have there needs to be a level of secrecy and censorship, because we can't be giving our enemies the information they need to destroy us, and we have to be planting propaganda with them so that they're confused so that we can beat them. There's this wartime logic that has that kind of deception baked into it, and some of when we look at the politicians that are historically admired in any given country, usually on the winning side, well, that's seen as a virtue. Oh, well, they did the right thing. They did a good job at that. The military intelligence did a good job of planting this disinformation in this sense, in this case, during this battle, that weakened that deceived the enemy to think this was going to happen, which allowed us to win and beat them. Mm-hmm. And like Machiavelli says, that is a criterion of how we view the success of a leader, whether it's a military leader or a political leader, or you could even go so far, you could take it down to business leaders, and then, so the tension is still there between the success that we, or the glory that we bestow on certain leaders and winners, and how much of that glory that is bestowed is because the person is just very good at lying, or is lying for the right reasons in a certain situation. It's a tricky thing to get your mind around, at least for me. Other people probably don't have that problem.
No, those are reasonable questions. I think, when you were saying all that, Harrison, I was thinking about the language of winning hearts and minds as opposed to full-on, unadulterated psychological operations. If it's perpetrated by the enemy or by the perceived evil party, then it's a psyop. It's fake news. It's it's
propaganda,
blatant propaganda. But if it's done by us, quote unquote, the good guys, then it's winning hearts and minds. It's making our information available to people who might not be so decided, and all of that flowery language.
What if it's all a psyop, and it always has been?
That's possible too. But drilling down to the why, the intentions of a particular side in a particular struggle is, and reconciling that with the tactics and strategies that are being used, like you said, that fall into a lot of gray areas that may appear to be morally ambiguous. This is reality. It's complicated, and we could pick a side to make things easier for ourselves so that we don't have to think too much about it. But then we'd be falling into the trap of giving up our liberty in a way, giving up our faculty for choosing in a more exact, authentic, a precise way, insofar as such a thing is even possible when we take sides in a particular struggle. All good questions. And I'm glad, Luke, that you brought up the, religion part. I wanted to mention that too. And it's something mentioned elsewhere, about its role in unifying a nation and its importance. So I look forward to discussing that further as well. Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Luke?
Not really. It was actually a very good exercise to read such a classic, because as you guys have never read it, and and I would just encourage everyone out there who's listening to this to read this short little book. I mean, it's really, as Harrison said, it's a really quick read, and there's lots to think about in it, and some things to disagree with or to get enraged over even, or other things that just fascinating. And so it's very productive reading. And as we all said, it's just great to get a glimpse a bit behind the curtain of what people actually think.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
One quick comment on, you mentioned that, none of us were taught this in school or had it as an option to read in school. I found out yesterday that the Pope banned the book, back in the 1500s, and it was a banned book for, I don't know, a couple hundred years or something. So the Pope saw what was in there the popes saw what was in there at the time and said, "Ooh, we can't have people actually realizing that this is the way things work. There's that whole discussion
that even popes think that way and act that way, right?
Yeah, because you can see that in there. Like Machiavelli's like, oh, well, Caesar Borgia, he should have just installed, a pope that was friendly in him, like this other guy did. And then here's how the cardinals work. And you have to have these many cardinals on your side so that you can have, it's just like, oh, wow. Okay. I'm sure the church appreciated having their politics laid bare like that. But interesting stuff. Anyways, we'll probably maybe on a future show get into some of the modern Machiavellians, like the ones mentioned in Burnham, and many other topics. So thanks, guys. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll have a link to a list of just a couple books that we mentioned on the show today in the show description. And if you liked it, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Post a comment if you like, and we will see you again in a week or so. Bye-bye.